What's cracking, everybody? My name's Scott, and we are back with some more Seattle Kraken news. And I know it's been a couple of weeks since we did a What's Kraken episode, but what can I say, there really just hasn't been all that much going on over the last couple of weeks. I mean, all we had was the expansion draft, which we did a live stream and a few videos about, the entry draft, which we did another live stream and a video about, and then some free agency signings, which there were even more videos about. So really not that much going on over the last little bit of time. Okay, so maybe there has been plenty going on over the last couple of weeks, and we've talked about quite a bit of it, just not necessarily in a What's Kraken episode specifically. That being said, there still are a couple of other things that slip through the cracks with all of those bigger events going on that we haven't yet had a chance to talk about. So we're going to take that chance now to get fully caught up with everything that's happened with Seattle over the last couple of weeks. But real quick, before we get to that, we do have a few updates on that roster of 30 players that the Kraken took during their expansion draft. Of course, as we've mentioned in prior videos, we do already know that the day after the expansion draft, the Kraken made their first ever trade in franchise history, sending their pick from the Arizona Coyotes in Tyler Pitlick to the Calgary Flames for a 4th round pick in the 2022 draft. Now, part of me does wonder if they couldn't have squeezed maybe a little bit more out of this situation, like maybe a 3rd round pick from Calgary or somewhere else, and maybe if they took Christian Fischer instead of Pitlick, they could have gotten a little bit more for him in a trade. But at the end of the day, the difference between a 3rd and a 4th really isn't that big, and at least they got something. Which is definitely saying something, because when it comes to Gavin Bayreuther, their pick from the Columbus Blue Jackets, they got nothing in return for him, as he went back to Columbus during free agency, as he was set to be a UFA when the Kraken selected him, and they obviously didn't sign him to a contract. And although at this point anyway, he is the only one so far who has left Seattle for nothing, when all is said and done, Bayreuther is very likely not to be the only player that Seattle took in the expansion draft that they'll get nothing in return for, as currently John Quenneville, their pick from the Blackhawks, who we talked about being one of the more confusing picks that they made, has also not been signed by a team, whether the Kraken or anybody else, and is currently an unrestricted free agent. So I think it's pretty safe to say the Kraken probably won't sign him, and regardless of whether or not he signs somewhere else, is going to be leaving that roster of 30 for nothing. But again, Quenneville hasn't signed anywhere else just yet, so I won't officially remove him from the list of 30 until that happens, or the Kraken start the season without him on one of their rosters. But going back to Bayreuther, he isn't even the only player on this list that has already found their way back to the team that the Kraken took them from in the expansion draft, as after picking up Philip Grubauer in free agency, the Kraken needed to move one of their NHL-ready goaltenders. So they sent Vitek Vanacek back to DC for a 2nd round pick in the 2023 draft. Now, of course, we've already talked about a little bit in the Grubauer signing video, the fact that there may have been a little bit of missed potential with the DC pick, because they did move another one of the guys that was available in the expansion draft to the Winnipeg Jets for 2 2nd round picks. So the fact that the Kraken just got one in return for the guy they took from them does mean that they maybe missed out on a little bit of opportunity when it came to return in picks, but still, there was no guarantee, or no one even expected, that Grubauer would be available or even willing to sign in Seattle when the expansion draft happened. So the fact that they got Vanacek in the expansion draft and maybe missed out on a 2nd round pick in return in a trade honestly isn't the worst thing ever, and I still think they made the right pick at the time. But moving on to the 4th, and at least to this point, last guy that has left that list of 30 already, the Kraken did get a pretty surprisingly good return, at least in my eyes, for another one of their more confusing picks in the expansion draft in Curtis McDermott, who they've moved to Colorado for a 4th round pick in the 2023 draft. Now, I already talked about in my grading the expansion draft video how confusing a pick this was, but the fact that they got a 4th round pick in return for him definitely makes it at least look a little bit better in hindsight. So, at least as things stand right now as of filming, 26 of the 30 players taken in the expansion draft remain at least available for the Kraken to have on their opening roster, again with the exception of John Quenneville being a UFA and there still being 4 RFAs that the Kraken could still sign. But still, as of now, only those 4 have officially left. Of course, another thing that happened during that expansion draft that we haven't yet had a chance to talk about, unless you were watching the live stream, is the fact that we did finally get to see live and in person what the home and away jerseys are going to look like for the Seattle Kraken in their first season. And I have to say, they look absolutely just as good as we expected them to based on that original image that we got just about a year ago. Honestly, in my admittedly somewhat biased opinion, these are some of the nicest jerseys right away in the entire league. I mean, I do still probably like Minnesota's better, but I would say these are certainly top 5 and maybe even top 3 in the league. Again, I know there are plenty of you who might not agree with them being ranked quite that high, but some of that for me does have to do with the fact that I will be cheering for the team that's wearing them, so that definitely plays a role. And really the only thing I would change about them is I did see some people kind of photoshopping in a collar that is a different color from the rest of the jersey, which I do think made them look a little bit better. But even still, and even if you're not a Kraken fan and maybe wouldn't think of these quite as highly as I necessarily might, I still don't see how they could be outside the top 10 or the top 3rd in the league as far as jerseys are concerned. I mean, even when it came to the online reaction, there pretty much seemed to be 2 groups of people. There were the majority that were the group of people that seemed to really, really like these jerseys, and then there was a smaller group of people who hated to admit that they really, really liked them. Which, if that is you, then don't worry. I get it. I understand that there are a lot of people out there that don't want to see another expansion franchise do as well as Vegas did. So they aren't going to be willing to admit that Seattle has done anything right up to this point, and you are entitled to hide your true opinion. Of course, the other big piece of news that came out during the whirlwind that was the last couple of weeks that we haven't had a chance to talk about is the schedule being released for the first season of the Seattle Kraken. Again, during that expansion draft day, we did hear that the Kraken will be playing their first ever game as a franchise against the Vegas Golden Knights in Vegas on October 12th. And then during the expansion draft event itself, they announced that the first home game would happen on October 23rd against the Vancouver Canucks. Some other games worth mentioning, of course, would include those games where they host the original 6, as those do tend to draw a little bit more attention than your otherwise typical game might. So on October 26th, they'll start that run with the Montreal Canadiens coming off of their Stanley Cup Finals appearance on October 26th, just a few days after that home opener against Vancouver. Then the Rangers on the 31st of October, the Chicago Blackhawks on the 17th of November, and then again the 17th of January. And between that, they'll have the Toronto Maple Leafs in the middle of December on the 19th, the Detroit Red Wings March 19th, and the Boston Bruins back in February on the 24th. And I will say that from what I've heard, especially that Bruins game, and I'm sure pretty much every other game, even outside of the original 6 ones, have already gotten pretty ridiculously expensive on the open market. So if you want to get into one of those games or any game this season, I would start looking for deals now and keep looking as much as you can. But getting back to the schedule, of course, it finally comes to an end on April 29th with the home game against the San Jose Sharks. Now, to break this schedule down a little bit more, you might notice that there is a pretty big gap in February. That, of course, is due to the Olympic break that they're planning in here. Now, there are some pretty big questions still remaining about whether or not the Olympics will work out for NHL players to be able to go this time around, but they have at least made this schedule as of right now in order to make that a possibility. If we do find out here in the near future that they have decided not to go to the Olympics this time and they can't get things worked out, then there is still a definite chance that things could switch around to have this look a little bit more evened out over the course of the entire season when it comes to not having games quite as bunched up on either side. But at least for now, as things stand at the moment, taking a look at my notes for a second, that does leave the Kraken with 9 games in October, 13 in November, 14 in December, then their busiest month is in January with 16. Then, of course, the Olympic break during February, which leaves them with just 3 games in that month, 13 in March, and then 14 in April to close out the season. The schedule does, again, as it is right now, have 15 back-to-back games in one night after another for the Kraken to be playing during the course of the season, which is a pretty big number and one of the higher ones across the league. But again, if the Olympic break doesn't end up happening and the NHL doesn't end up going to the Olympics, then that will get evened out a little bit more. We'll see more games in February most likely, and a lot of those back-to-backs will come off the schedule. Because of this higher number of back-to-backs, again, this is another reason that the Kraken are very happy to go into the season with 2 starting caliber goaltenders in more of a tandem type of role, because again, back-to-backs are very rarely done both games by the same goaltender. And on top of that high number of back-to-backs the Kraken have, they also have one of the harder schedules in the league when it comes to playing a team that's coming in with rest, when they're coming into the game without rest, and fewer games the other way around where they are more rested than the team that they're about to play, which does make a difference over the grand scheme of things. So even though they are in one of the easier divisions in the NHL and should be able to beat up on some of their division rivals, they still don't have the easiest schedule when it comes to the rest of the team versus the rest of the opponents they'll be playing. But again, there's still no guarantee that this will end up being the final schedule if they don't go to the Olympics. And even if it is, there still are plenty of things that will affect the Kraken season a little bit more than the schedule that could still happen before the season gets started via trades or free agency signings as far as the roster is built. And that definitely does include signing the 4 RFAs that they still have unsigned on the roster, who would be Carson Twarynski, Dennis Cholowski, Will Borgen, and Vince Dunn, with the last one of those in Dunn being one of the 17 players across the league that filed for arbitration. As far as what arbitration is and what that means for Dunn and the Kraken, basically, if by a certain date they haven't come to an agreement on a contract, then they'll sit down with an arbitrator who will hear arguments from both sides about how much they think Dunn is worth, and then the arbitrator will say how much they think Dunn should be paid. Then it's up to the Kraken to decide whether or not they want to sign Dunn to that, and if they don't, he ends up becoming an unrestricted free agent. Now, it has to be said that the vast majority of players that file for arbitration end up getting signed before that becomes a thing. It's mostly just a fallback plan on the player's part to have a way out if nothing ends up getting done with the team that they're a part of. Especially considering how much cap space the Kraken have, I don't think that it's going to be an issue with Dunn. I'm sure that they'll end up getting him signed before the arbitration date, as again, most teams, including the Kraken, probably don't want to be dealing with that in their first offseason. Of course, the other possibility with Dunn, which also could apply to Borgen as well, is the fact that the Kraken still have too many NHL-ready defensemen, and we know that they're trying to move at least one, if not more of them. So Dunn could end up getting traded elsewhere and then signing a contract there, though personally, he's the type of player I would very much like to see them keep, as I think his potential is very high going forward. Otherwise, the only other thing that's come out news-wise as far as the Kraken are concerned is the whole Grubauer contract situation, where the contract that they originally signed Grubauer to was rejected by the NHL because there was too much of a gap between how much he was getting paid in the second season and the third season of that contract. So the Kraken ended up having to move $250,000 from the third season to the second season in order to have things not so front-loaded and have it be a legal contract, which they did the same day that the contract was rejected. And we're assuming that that one probably gets approved, but it does not mean that Grubauer is going to go back to free agency. He will be on the Seattle Kraken next year. And as far as this not being a great look for the team, I mean, it's definitely not a good look, but apparently this is something that doesn't happen terribly infrequently across the league. It mostly just became news because it is something that's happening with Seattle, who are definitely still forefront in the news being a new team. But if you have any questions or thoughts of your own on any of that, or really anything we talked about in this video, or maybe some games that you're most excited about on that schedule that you want to mention in the comments section, please do leave those down below. Otherwise, I think we have reached the end of this one, so if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you liked or enjoyed this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Otherwise, be good to each other and go Kraken.